My mother was a quiet, unremarkable woman, or so I thought. When her lawyer handed me the deed to a boarded-up cottage she had kept secret for 40 years, I expected to find old furniture and moth-eaten clothes. Instead, I unburied a terrifying truth that rewrote my entire existence. My mother, Catherine Hayes, died on a rainy Tuesday in October. She was 68, a retired middle school librarian who lived in a beige house in suburban New Jersey, drove a beige Toyota, and wore beige cardigans. She was the most fiercely ordinary person I had ever known. We weren't exceptionally close. She always kept me at a comfortable, polite distance, as if afraid that holding me too tight might break us both. When she passed away from a sudden aneurysm, my grief was real, but it was a quiet, uncomplicated grief. I expected her affairs to be just as orderly and uneventful as her life. 6 months later, I sat in the polished mahogany office of Arthur Pendleton, an estate lawyer in downtown Boston. Arthur was a friend of a friend, an older gentleman who had handled the probate with crisp efficiency. Everything was standard. The suburban house went to me, her modest life insurance covered the funeral, and her savings account had just enough left over to pay off my student loans. But then, Arthur cleared his throat, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. He slid a thick, manila envelope across the desk. It looked ancient, the edges yellowed and fraying. "Abigail," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "I found this in a secondary safe deposit box at Chase Bank. It was held under a trust your mother established in 1986. The trust was completely dormant until her death." I frowned, picking up the envelope. My mother didn't have trusts. She clipped coupons for laundry detergent. "Apparently, she did," Arthur replied smoothly. "Inside is a deed to a property in the remote Appalachian foothills of upstate New York, near a logging town called Oakhaven. It's a privately owned parcel of land, roughly 14 acres, completely off the grid, and there is a structure on it, a cottage." I stared at the deed in my hands. The paper was crisp, bearing the official seal of the county clerk, dated the 14th of October, 1986. That was exactly 2 months before I was born. "Why would she have a cottage in the woods?" I asked, my heart doing a strange, irregular flutter. "She hated the outdoors. She claimed she was allergic to pine trees." Arthur leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. "I cannot speak to your mother's motivations, Abigail, but the property taxes have been paid anonymously through a cashier's check every single year for nearly 40 years. It is now legally yours." When I told my husband, David, about the cottage, he was skeptical but intrigued. David is a structural engineer, a man of logic and blueprints. To him, an abandoned cottage was either a liability waiting to collapse or a hidden real estate gem we could flip for a down payment on a bigger house. He convinced me we needed to see it. The drive up to Oakhaven took 6 hours. The further north we went, the more the landscape shifted from manicured suburbs to dense, unforgiving wilderness. The GPS lost signal long before we reached the coordinates Arthur had provided. We had to rely on a faded topological map I'd printed out at the library. We turned off the paved highway onto a gravel road, then off the gravel road onto a dirt logging trail that looked like it hadn't been used since the Reagan administration. "Are you sure this is the right way?" David asked, gripping the steering wheel as our SUV violently bounced over deep ruts and exposed tree roots. "The map says the driveway should be coming up on the left," I muttered, peering through the dense canopy of ancient hemlocks and pines. The woods here were suffocatingly thick, blocking out the mid-afternoon sun and casting everything in a gloomy twilight haze. Then, we saw it. It wasn't a driveway so much as a scarred path through the overgrowth. At the entrance, an iron gate, rusted shut and chained, blocked our path. We had to leave the car and hike the remaining quarter-mile on foot. As the cottage finally came into view through the trees, a cold chill swept over the back of my neck. My mother's cottage wasn't some quaint woodland retreat. It looked like a fortress disguised as a house. It was a single-story, cinder block and timber structure. Every single window was sealed shut with heavy, weather-beaten wooden boards, bolted into the masonry with industrial steel lag screws. The front door was solid steel, the kind you would see on a commercial warehouse, secured by 3 heavy-duty master locks. Nature had tried to reclaim the building. Ivy choked the chimney, and moss blanketed the rotting shingles of the roof. But the absolute finality of the boarding was unmistakable. This house wasn't just closed up to keep vandals out, it was boarded up to keep something inside. "Good Lord," David whispered, dropping his duffel bag in the damp leaves. "Your mom really didn't want any visitors, did she?" I walked up to the heavy steel door, my fingers grazing the rusted padlocks. The silence of the woods was absolute. No birds, no wind, Just the heavy, oppressive feeling that we were trespassing on a ghost. David, I said, my voice barely a breath. Get the crowbar. It took David nearly an hour to compromise the front door. The padlocks were rusted solid, requiring him to use a heavy-duty angle grinder we had brought along in the trunk, powered by a portable generator. The sound of screaming metal shattered the eerie quiet of the forest, sending a flock of unseen crows launching into the sky. When the third lock finally gave way, dropping to the porch with a heavy thud, David and I exchanged a long, uneasy look. He gripped the heavy handle, planted his boot against the doorframe, and pulled. With a sickening metallic shriek, the heavy steel door swung outward. A wave of air washed over us, but it didn't smell like the damp, rotting wood of a typical abandoned cabin. It smelled sterile. It smelled like dust, old paper, and a faint, chemical undertone, like developing fluid from a darkroom. I clicked on my heavy-duty flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom, dancing heavily with disturbed dust motes. We stepped over the threshold. The interior was a jarring contrast to the decaying, overgrown exterior. It was a perfectly preserved time capsule from 1986, untouched by rodents or the elements, sealed as tight as a tomb. The living room was modest, furnished with a brown corduroy sofa, a bulky cathode ray tube television, and a shag rug. But what stopped me dead in my tracks were the boxes. Dozens and dozens of heavy plastic storage tubs were stacked against the walls, reaching almost to the ceiling. "What is all this?" David asked, his flashlight beam sweeping across the room. He stepped forward, wiping a layer of dust off the top of the nearest bin. I didn't answer. I was drawn to the hallway. As I walked further into the house, I realized the layout was wrong. The windows we had seen from the outside didn't match the interior walls. The entire inside of the cottage had been reinforced. The walls were lined with soundproofing foam, the kind used in recording studios, now dry-rotted and crumbling like yellowed sponge. I pushed open the door to what should have been the master bedroom. My flashlight beam hit the back wall, and I gasped, stumbling backward into the doorframe. "David!" I yelled, my voice cracking with sudden panic. "David, get in here!" Heavy footsteps echoed down the hall as David ran in, stopping abruptly beside me. The bedroom wasn't a bedroom at all. It was a staging ground, a command center. The four walls were completely covered from floor to ceiling in corkboard, and pinned to that corkboard was a chaotic, dizzying web of information. There were hundreds of photographs, newspaper clippings, and legal documents, all connected by an intricate, maddening network of red and black yarn. It was the terrifying obsession of a madman, or a desperate woman. I stepped closer, my hands trembling as I directed the light over the clippings. They were all articles from the late 1970s and early 1980s. Headlines blared from the Boston Globe and the New York Times. Prominent Judge Richard Harrington found dead in apparent suicide. District Attorney Thomas Gallagher indicted in missing union funds scandal. Arson. Suspected in warehouse fire. 3 tragically killed. Pinned next to these clippings were candid, long-lens surveillance photographs. Pictures of men in expensive suits getting into limousines, handing envelopes to men in alleyways, walking into private clubs, and written in the margins, in the unmistakable, neat, looping cursive of my mother, the woman who made me peanut butter sandwiches and reminded me to wear my galoshes, were terrifying annotations. Gallagher lied. Harrington knew about the offshore accounts. They are burning the evidence. Who is next? Follow the money through the Cayman Shell Company. Abby, David said, his voice stripped of all its usual confidence. Your mother, was she a private investigator? Was she working for the FBI? She was a librarian, I whispered, feeling the room spinning around me. She cataloged the Dewey Decimal System. She didn't stalk corrupt politicians, but the evidence was right in front of me. I moved to a heavy oak desk sitting in the center of the room. On it sat a vintage Smith Corona typewriter, a massive shortwave radio setup, and a stack of black, leather-bound ledgers. I opened the top ledger. It wasn't a diary. It was a logbook. Dates, times, coordinates, and lists of offshore bank account numbers. And then, my flashlight caught a reflection on the floor beneath the desk. I knelt down, brushing aside the edge of a faded Persian rug. Beneath it, set flush into the hardwood floor, was a heavy steel trapdoor with a recessed combination dial. David saw it too. He immediately knelt beside me. A safe, embedded in the foundation. How do we open it? I asked, looking at the dial. David rubbed his jaw. We don't. Not without a blowtorch or the combination. Do you have any idea what numbers she might use? A birthday? An anniversary? I thought about my mother. Her life was a locked box even when she was alive, but I remembered the date on the deed, the 14th of October, 1986. Try the 14th of October, 2086, I said. David carefully spun the heavy brass dial. 10 right, 14 left, 86 right. He grabbed the recessed handle and pulled. It didn't budge. No luck, he said, shaking his head. Think, Abby. What else? I looked up at the wall of madness. My eyes scanned the hundreds of dates scribbled on the Polaroids, but then I looked down at the desk again. Next to the typewriter was a small silver locket. I picked it up and popped it open. Inside wasn't a picture of me, or my father who had supposedly died before I was born. It was a tiny scrap of paper. Written on it was a sequence. The 22nd of April 2083. Try the 22nd of April 1983, I said, handing the scrap to David. He spun the dial again. 4, 22, 83. Clack. The heavy locking mechanism retracted with a sound that seemed deafening in the silent house. David gripped the handle and heaved. The trapdoor groaned, protesting on rusted hinges, before swinging up and open. We leaned over the hole, shining our flashlights into the dark cavity. It wasn't filled with gold bars or stacks of $100 bills. Inside the cavity were 3 items: a heavy, black, military-grade pistol, a thick stack of passports, all bearing my mother's photograph but under 6 different names, and at the bottom, a sealed waterproof manila envelope with a single word written on the front in thick black marker. Abigail. My hands shook so violently I could barely pick it up. I tore the thick plastic seal, reaching inside. I pulled out a single sheet of paper, a birth certificate. But it wasn't mine. It was issued by the state of Massachusetts. It bore the date the 14th of December, 1986, my birthday. But the child's name wasn't Abigail Hayes. The name on the certificate was Claire Gallagher, and the parents listed were not Catherine and Michael Hayes. They were Thomas and Diane Gallagher. The same Thomas Gallagher staring down at me from the surveillance photos on the wall. Tucked behind the birth certificate was a handwritten letter. I unfolded it, my mother's neat cursive blurring as tears welled in my eyes. My dearest Abigail, if you are reading this, it means I am dead, and the people who murdered your real parents have finally stopped looking for us. I am not your mother. I was the private investigator hired by your father, Thomas Gallagher, to hide you before his own associates assassinated him to cover up a multi-million-dollar union embezzlement ring. I stole you from your crib the night the fire took your family. I gave up my life, my identity, and my career to become Catherine Hayes, so that you could live. But the truth is buried in this room, and the people who burned your family alive are still out there. They never stopped looking for the missing Gallagher heir. Run, Abby. Take the passports, leave David behind if you have to, and run. The silence in the room was no longer just the quiet of an abandoned house. It was a suffocating, heavy vacuum that seemed to draw all the oxygen from my lungs. I read the final line of Catherine's letter again. Run, Abby. Take the passports, leave David behind if you have to, and run. My mother had known. Even from the grave, she had known something I was completely blind to. Abby? David's voice broke the silence. He was standing on the other side of the heavy oak desk, his flashlight beam aimed directly at my face, blinding me. What does it say? What's in the envelope? I instinctively folded the letter and shoved it into the back pocket of my jeans, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Nothing, I lied, my voice shaking. Just some old tax documents. A deed to another plot of land. David lowered the flashlight, illuminating the space between us. His eyes drifted from my trembling hands to the open trapdoor, and then to the birth certificate resting on the edge of the desk. The name Claire Gallagher was printed in bold, undeniable ink. You're a terrible liar, Abigail, David said. His voice was entirely different. The warm, slightly exasperated tone of my husband of 4 years was gone, replaced by a flat, terrifyingly calm cadence. He took a slow step around the desk. He didn't look at me. He looked at the black ledger sitting open on the desk, the one filled with coordinates and offshore accounts. He reached out, his fingers tracing the columns of numbers. Do you have any idea what this is? He murmured, a strange smile touching the corners of his mouth. This isn't just a diary. This is leverage. The people Catherine was tracking. Gregory Dunn and his associates in the Longshoremen's Union. They laundered over $200 million through shell companies in the 80s. Dunn is a state senator now. How do you know that name? I whispered, taking a step backward. David, How do you know who Gregory Dunn is? David finally looked at me. The man I had shared a bed with, the man who had held my hand when we buried my mother, looked like an absolute stranger. Because my mother's maiden name was Dunn, Abby, he said softly. Gregory is my uncle. The room spun. I grabbed the edge of the corkboard to steady myself, a pushpin biting sharply into my thumb. Suddenly, 100 tiny, easily dismissed memories slammed into place. How we met at a coffee shop right near my mother's house. How he had insisted on handling all the paperwork after she died. How eager he was to drive up to this remote, off-the-grid location. You were looking for this, I choked out. The betrayal feeling like a physical knife in my gut. You didn't marry me. You were planted. It wasn't supposed to take 4 years, David admitted, running a hand through his hair, looking almost inconvenienced. We knew Catherine Hayes was a ghost, a remnant of the Gallagher mess. Uncle Gregory suspected she took the kid, but Catherine was a pro. She covered her tracks perfectly. It wasn't until she died and the probate opened that we finally got a thread to pull. And now, thanks to you, we have the ledger, and we have the heir. Crunch, crunch. The unmistakable sound of heavy tires rolling over gravel and dead branches drifted through the thick cinder block walls. Someone was pulling up the overgrown driveway. I texted them when we hit the logging road, David said, glancing toward the boarded-up window. They're here to clean this up, Abby. Just hand me the ledger, the gun, and the passports. We can make this easy. Uncle Gregory doesn't want a mess. Adrenaline, pure and blinding, flooded my system. I looked at the heavy angle grinder resting on the floor where David had left it. I looked at the open safe. I'm sorry, David, I whispered. For what? He asked, stepping toward me. I didn't answer. I lunged. I grabbed the heavy cast-iron flashlight from the desk and swung it with every ounce of strength I had. The heavy metal barrel connected solidly with the side of David's knee. He let out a sharp cry of pain, his leg buckling instantly. He crashed to the hardwood floor, knocking over a stack of plastic storage bins. Without hesitating, I dropped the flashlight and dove for the open trapdoor. I grabbed the heavy military-grade pistol, the stack of passports, and the black ledger. I shoved them frantically into my canvas backpack. Abby, stop! David yelled, scrambling on the floor, his hand reaching out to grab my ankle. I kicked back violently, my hiking boot connecting with his shoulder. I turned and sprinted out of the bedroom, down the narrow, soundproofed hallway. As I reached the living room, a heavy, booming sound echoed through the house. Someone was using a battering ram on the steel front door. I remembered the layout of the cottage from the outside. There was a reinforced back door off the kitchen. I bolted through the dark kitchen, my hands blindly searching for the deadbolts in the gloom. The front door screamed in protest as another massive blow struck it. The metal hinges began to tear from the concrete. I found the heavy metal latch on the back door. I threw it open, pushing my shoulder against the steel, and burst out into the damp, twilight air of the dense forest. Just as I hit the tree line, I heard the front door give way with a deafening crash. She's out the back! Go, go, go! A rough voice shouted from inside the cottage. I didn't look back. I plunged into the suffocating darkness of the Appalachian woods. The woods were a nightmare of briars, hidden ravines, and rotting logs. I ran until my lungs burned, and my legs felt like lead, the sounds of shouting men and snapping branches echoing behind me. Always walk in the streams, Abby. It confuses the dogs. The memory hit me like a lightning bolt. I was 10 years old, complaining about wet sneakers during a sudden rainstorm on one of our mandatory camping trips. My mother, Catherine, had always insisted on these grueling weekend excursions. I used to think she was just an eccentric outdoorswoman. Now, running for my life, I realized she had been running a covert boot camp. She was training me to survive the very night she knew would eventually come. I veered left, sliding down a steep, muddy embankment until my boots hit the freezing, rushing water of a narrow creek. I waded directly into the center of it, the icy water biting through my jeans, and began to run upstream. Behind me, the sweeping beams of high-powered tactical flashlights cut through the canopy. Spread out. She couldn't have gone far, a man barked. His voice was deep, authoritative. Not David. These were Gregory Dunn's professional cleaners. I stayed in the water for what felt like hours, fighting against the current, letting the sound of the rushing water mask my footsteps. My mother's voice kept playing in my head, a phantom guide in the dark. If you need to hide, get elevated. People rarely look up in the dark. I found a massive, ancient oak tree with low-hanging branches near the edge of the creek. Ignoring the exhaustion tearing at my muscles, I pulled myself up, climbing 20 feet into the dense, leafy canopy. I straddled a thick branch, hugging the trunk, trying to silence my ragged breathing. 10 minutes later, two men emerged from the brush below. One held a suppressed submachine gun. The other was scanning the ground with a thermal monocular. Tracks end at the water. Russell, the man with the gun, said, spitting into the dirt. Russell lowered the monocular. She's a civilian. She'll panic and freeze to death out here before morning. Tell Mr. Dunn we have the husband secured, but the girl and the ledger are gone. They turned and faded back into the dark woods. I stayed in that tree until the sun began to bleed pale gray light through the forest canopy. Only when the woods were filled with the sound of morning birds did I dare to climb down. Every muscle screamed, but the terror had crystallized into something cold and sharp. Anger. I hiked for 6 more hours, using the moss on the trees to navigate strictly due east, just as my mother had taught me. By midday, I broke through the tree line and stumbled onto a paved 2-lane highway. I hitched a ride in the back of an empty pickup truck belonging to a local farmer, riding silently to a Greyhound station in a Rust Belt town 40 miles away. In the filthy bathroom of the bus station, I washed the mud from my face. I opened my backpack and pulled out the stack of passports. I flipped through them, looking at my own face, staring back at me under 6 different aliases. I chose one with a Canadian stamp, Rebecca Lawson. I took the black pistol and shoved it into the waistband of my jeans, letting my sweater cover it. Then, I opened the black ledger. Catherine hadn't just collected evidence. She had collected access. Alongside the offshore account numbers were the complex routing instructions and passcodes the Dunn syndicate used to move their dirty money, the money they had murdered my real parents for. I didn't run into the shadows to hide and cower for the rest of my life. My mother had given up everything to keep me safe, and David had tried to sell me back to the wolves. Over the next 3 weeks, moving constantly between cheap motels in Montreal and Toronto, I systematically dismantled Senator Gregory Dunn's empire. I used Catherine's meticulously documented ledgers to drain the offshore accounts, routing the millions of dollars through untraceable crypto mixers before donating it anonymously to burn victim charities across the country. But I didn't stop at the money. I sent copies of the ledgers, the surveillance photos, and my mother's detailed annotations to the FBI field office in Boston, the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, and the investigative desks of 3 major national newspapers. I was sitting in a small cafe in Zurich, sipping a dark espresso, when the breaking news flashed across the television above the counter. State Senator Gregory Dunn arrested in sweeping federal indictment. Alleged ties to 1980s, union murders uncovered. The screen showed footage of the FBI raiding Dunn's lavish estate, and trailing behind him in handcuffs, looking bruised, terrified, and utterly defeated, was David. I watched the man I had once loved being shoved into the back of a federal vehicle. I felt no pity. I felt no heartbreak. The woman who had loved him, Abigail Hayes, died in the woods of upstate New York. I paid for my coffee, left a generous tip, and walked out into the crisp European air. I had a new name, a vast fortune, and the legacy of 2 mothers to uphold. One gave me my life, and the other taught me how to weaponize it. This journey started with a boarded-up cottage and ended with me reclaiming a stolen life. Catherine Hayes wasn't my biological mother, but she was my absolute savior. Now, I live in the shadows, making sure those who prey on the innocent face justice. If my story captivated you, please like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more real-life mysteries and survival stories.